Hey viewers! Hope you're all doing great. Before I start the story, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy my videos, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. How medieval peasant mothers treated their children. When we speak of medieval England's peasant mothers, we step into a world where survival was uncertain, life was harsh, and children's lives hung by thread. The years between c.1100 and c.1500 saw high infant mortality, frequent famines, disease, and social upheavals. Yet children were born, raised, loved, and lost in thousands of humble cottages across the countryside. Mothers bore and reared children in conditions unlike our modern comforts. They nursed, protected, disciplined, comforted, and taught them, all the while laboring under the weight of daily toil. This story aims to evoke how peasant mothers in medieval England treated their children, with endurance, affection, strictness, and sacrifice. Let us imagine smoke-dark cottages, low doorways, the crackle of hearths, and children clinging to their mothers as the dusk falls. In a cottage of wattle and daub, with a low timbered roof and rush-strewn floor, a peasant mother endures the pains of childbirth. She is supported by local women, midwives, elder neighbors, gathered in dim light. The air smells of herbs, damp earth, and flickering rushlights. Childbirth in medieval England was perilous. The mother risked hemorrhage, infection, and complications. The child might be stillborn or die soon after. In the first year, many infants did not survive. From the moment of birth, the mother's treatment of her child centers on survival. She wraps the infant in linen strips, swaddling the arms and legs to restrain them and protect limbs. She might tie the baby in the cradle so it cannot crawl into danger. She nurses the child at her breast. In peasant households, mothers rarely had the privilege of hiring a wet nurse. Thus the mother herself was normally the principal feeder. If the mother died or was too weak, some households sought a wet nurse or other family member to step in. As the child grows, the mother treats them with vigilance. She changes swaddling, loosens bindings when the child begins to move, and watches for signs of illness. She keeps the baby close, often carrying it in arms while working fields, hearth, tasks, so that danger, fire, sharp tools, stray animals, is minimized. Many children were baptized soon after birth, and mothers were involved in that ritual, requesting clergy, selecting godparents, and caring for the child's spiritual welfare. The mother's role thus combined the physical and the spiritual. In the first months of life, the mother soothes the child's crying, shields it from cold drafts, listens for coughs or fever. She murmurs prayers, applies poultices of herbs, watches breath, and keeps the hearth warm. Sometimes she uses talismans or religious aids. A birthing girdle, a strip of parchment inscribed with prayers worn around her waist during labor, or placed upon the child for protection. Such objects reflect the blending of faith and maternal care in medieval life. Infants' mortality loomed large. Many mothers treated each child with both hope and sorrow, knowing that loss was tragically common. The care was intense, yet fragile. Imagine the glow of a small hearth inside a smoke-stained cottage, the faint crackle of burning wood. A peasant mother bends over her infant, no longer a newborn, but a small, restless child learning to stretch, to reach, to crawl. In medieval England, children were often nursed for 1 or 2 years, sometimes longer if famine struck and solid food was scarce. The mother's milk was seen as both nourishment and protection, keeping the infant safe in the uncertain early years. For a peasant woman, breastfeeding was not only practical but necessary. Cow's milk was not always safe, clean, or affordable, and alternatives were dangerous. When the child was ready to wean, the process was gradual. Mothers sometimes used softened bread soaked in broth, or pottage, a thick stew of oats, barley, or peas. The child sat on the mother's lap, and she patiently spooned food into the tiny mouth. Mess, laughter, and sometimes tears followed. She wiped the child's face with the corner of her apron, whispering quiet reassurances. But this stage brought new risks. Once children left the safety of constant breastfeeding, their survival depended on the quality of food and the cleanliness of water, both often precarious. Mothers remained vigilant, tasting food before offering it, checking pots, boiling water when possible. As toddlers, children grew curious and clumsy. Mothers tied them in cradles or benches to keep them safe while she worked at the hearth or churned butter. Sometimes a wooden leading string was fastened to a child's waist or shoulders, allowing the little one to toddle without straying into the fire or out the cottage door. The mother's treatment here was both protective and practical. She scolded when small hands reached for the fire. She guided tiny feet over uneven floors. She soothed scraped knees with gentle touches. Her tone was often firm, for dangers were many, yet affection glowed in her steady presence. Clothing for small children was simple. Boys and girls wore the same long gowns until about age 7. Mothers dressed toddlers in woolen or linen smocks, tied with cords. These garments kept children warm, but also made it easier for mothers to carry or change them. She washed these garments at the riverbank or in wooden tubs, scrubbing with ash or lye. Her hands red from the cold water. Peasant mothers taught toddlers small tasks early. A 2- or 3-year-old might be asked to carry kindling, pick herbs, or mind younger siblings. The mother's tone mixed gentle encouragement with correction. She praised small achievements, good child, but corrected swiftly when a chore was forgotten. Play too was part of her care. Mothers gave children simple toys. Rag dolls stuffed with wool, wooden animals carved by fathers, pebbles and sticks. Sometimes, a pig's bladder blown into a ball served for games. While not all mothers had time for long play, they encouraged laughter during brief moments of rest. Disease and accident were ever present. Mothers treated coughs with honey, rubbed bruises with salves of herbs, and whispered prayers over fevers. She was both nurse and comforter, balancing work with the endless demands of children's ailments. Above all, her role was watchfulness. The peasant mother treated her toddler with a blend of strict discipline and tender care, shaping early habits that would decide whether the child could survive the years ahead. Picture the small cottage again, its air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and boiling pottage. The peasant mother looks down at her child, now past the fragile toddler years. Survival to this age was itself an achievement. Many mothers had already buried infants, so each child who reached 5 or 6 years old was cherished, though not indulged, for life was far too hard. By this stage, the mother's treatment of her child shifted. The child was no longer swaddled, no longer tied to the cradle, but was now expected to behave with a degree of obedience. A peasant mother's patience had its limits. When children disobeyed or refused to work, she corrected them sharply, sometimes with a smack, sometimes with stern words. Medieval thought did not imagine childhood as a time of free play alone. It was seen as a period for training souls and shaping workers for the household. At 5, both boys and girls wore long tunics or gowns, tied with belts. Mothers often cut and stitched these garments by hand, sometimes refashioning old clothes from adults into smaller versions for children. She might scold if the child dirtied the tunic too quickly, reminding them of the work it took to clean and mend. The mother introduced children to faith at this age. She led them in morning prayers, taught them to cross themselves, and encouraged them to repeat the Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer, in Latin, even if they did not fully understand it. She wanted her children to be God-fearing, as religion was central to daily survival and the promise of salvation. Discipline was part of love. A medieval mother believed correction prevented idleness and sin. Light smacks, pulling of ears, or stern looks were common. Chronicles and sermons of the time often approved such correction, urging parents not to spare the rod. Yet affection coexisted with severity. After scolding, the mother might smooth the child's hair, offer bread, or draw them to her lap, showing that discipline came with care. At 6 or 7, children began to take on chores that shaped their identities. Mothers trained daughters to spin wool, sweep floors, fetch water, and mind younger siblings. Sons helped gather wood, tend animals, or scare birds from crops. The mother oversaw these tasks, correcting mistakes with sharp eyes and sharp tongue, but also praising good work, for a diligent child brought honor to the household. Play remained, but always under the mother's watch. She might tolerate children running with sticks, tossing pebbles, or singing songs, so long as it did not interfere with chores. Sometimes she joined, humming lullabies or rhymes passed down through generations. In these quiet moments, her treatment of children softened, revealing tenderness that balanced the harshness of survival. Illness often struck in these years. Mothers cared for fevers with herbal remedies: sage, thyme, chamomile, and honey. They applied poultices to wounds, whispered charms, and prayed over their children's beds. When remedies failed, grief filled the cottage. Medieval mothers were familiar with loss, yet each child lost tore deeply. Their treatment of surviving children was shaped by this fragile balance between love and the ever-present shadow of death. Thus, by 7 years old, the child of a peasant mother was no longer simply a baby but an active member of the household, shaped by a mother's discipline, guidance, and affection, always with the echo of survival in every gesture. If you picture a medieval peasant mother in her everyday world, the image might not be one of luxury or calm, but rather of constant motion, constant work, and yet, woven into this life of struggle, moments of tenderness and connection with her children. Let us step quietly into that picture together. Imagine the low, timber-framed cottage, its thatched roof damp from last night's rain, smoke curling faintly from a central hearth where a small fire struggles to keep alive. The floor is earthen, uneven, and cool beneath bare feet. The air smells of wood smoke, boiled grains, and sometimes animals that shared the same roof. Here, in this dim and simple space, a mother raised her children, not with the comforts we expect today, but with a strength shaped by hardship. Mothers in medieval peasant households cared for their children with simple, direct affection. Infants were often swaddled tightly, wrapped in cloth strips to keep their limbs straight, which people at the time believed was necessary for proper growth. This practice could seem restrictive to modern eyes, yet it was seen as protective, a way to guard fragile bodies in an unpredictable world. Mothers would keep their babies close, sometimes carrying them as they worked, tied with cloth or cradled on the hip, moving about the daily tasks of fetching water, kneading bread, or tending the garden. Breastfeeding was the norm. Peasant women rarely sent their infants to wet nurses, unlike noble or wealthy families. Instead, the bond between mother and child grew in those long hours of feeding, the baby lulled by the rhythm of her breath and the crackle of the hearth nearby. Some mothers might whisper prayers, asking saints to keep their little ones safe in a world where childhood illnesses were heartbreakingly common. Children did not grow up separated from the work of the household. From the moment they could walk steadily, they were drawn into daily chores. And it was most often the mother who guided them gently, patiently, or sometimes sternly, into learning these tasks. A daughter might sit beside her mother, learning to spin wool on a simple spindle, her small hands fumbling with tufts of fleece until practice made her motions smoother. A son might be sent with his mother to the fields, first simply to carry kindling or gather herbs, later to take on heavier work alongside his father. Mothers were the quiet instructors, repeating the same gestures until little eyes learned to copy them. Imagine the slow rhythm of a mother's voice, repeating instructions softly, her child imitating her movements clumsily at first. The patience, the correction, the sighs of frustration, and the occasional smile when the child managed to succeed. This was the medieval classroom, unrecorded, but central to survival. Medieval society placed strong emphasis on obedience and order, and peasant mothers upheld this within the home. Discipline was often firm, sometimes even physical. A sharp word, a raised hand, or a quick smack was not considered unusual. It was thought to prepare children for a difficult life ahead. Yet discipline was balanced with care. A mother's harshness was not usually cruelty, but the urgency of a woman who knew survival depended on her children learning rules quickly. Still, tenderness did find its place. After a child stumbled or hurt themselves, it was the mother who gathered them into her lap, whispering soothing words, perhaps crossing herself as she prayed for their pain to pass. Such small moments, though rarely recorded in chronicles, were part of the silent rhythm of peasant family life. Religion was interwoven with every stage of a child's upbringing. From baptism in the village church, an event mothers often prepared for with care, to the simple prayers taught at the bedside, Mothers were the first guides of faith. A medieval peasant mother might murmur Latin words she herself barely understood, passing on not theology, but the comfort of ritual. For sick children, mothers sometimes turned to charms, herbs, or whispered blessings, blending Christianity with older folk practices. She might rub a feverish child with healing plants, while muttering protective words passed down through generations. In her mind, every method had value if it could help preserve her child's fragile life. Although survival often overshadowed tenderness, there is evidence that peasant mothers loved their children deeply. Some records describe mothers weeping over the graves of little ones lost to famine or plague. Others show how families would share meager food, giving children the better portion when possible. Picture a winter's night, when the wind howls through the gaps in the wooden walls. A mother draws her children close around the hearth, tucking them under rough woolen blankets, sharing her own body warmth to shield them from the cold. The crackling firelight glows on her weary face as she strokes the hair of her youngest, humming a tune she learned from her own mother. In these quiet, intimate moments, her love was undeniable. Mothers were also responsible for clothing their children. This meant endless hours of spinning, weaving, sewing, and patching. Children often wore hand-me-down garments, sometimes cut down from older siblings' clothes. Shoes were rare for poorer families. A mother might wrap her child's feet in cloth or stuff straw into worn sandals. Every stitch carried both necessity and care. Though the clothes were coarse, they were acts of love. A mother's eyes would scan her children daily for signs of warmth, checking if sleeves were long enough, if hems still held strong. Even in poverty, she sought to give them what little comfort she could. The role of a peasant mother was not only nurturing but also deeply burdensome. High birth rates meant women often had many children, yet infant mortality was tragically high. Some mothers might bury as many children as they raised. Each loss weighed heavily, and yet life demanded that they continue working, continue caring for the living. Despite this hardship, mothers clung to hope. They looked for signs of strength in their children, the sturdy step of a boy helping in the fields, or the nimble fingers of a girl threading a needle. In these small successes, a mother found reassurance that her labor was not in vain. In this way, medieval peasant mothers shaped the lives of their children, not with luxury, not with written lessons, but with unending labor, discipline, faith, and love woven into the fabric of each day. Let us drift further into that old world together. The life of a medieval peasant mother and her children did not unfold all at once, but in stages, marked by the child's growth, the turning of the seasons, and the ever-present rhythms of village life. Each age brought its own cares and its own methods of care. So now, close your eyes if you wish, and imagine again the crackling fire, the creak of wooden beams above, the earthy smell of damp clay floors. Picture the mother, her hands roughened by labor, her face marked by the sun and years of toil, watching her child grow before her eyes. The earliest stage of life was the most precarious. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common, and mothers knew the fragility of these tiny lives. From the moment of birth, a mother's entire focus centered on survival. Birth itself usually took place at home, attended by other village women, midwives, or sometimes simply the mother's female relatives. A peasant mother might be surrounded by neighbors who murmured prayers, offered herbs for easing pain, and held cloths ready to swaddle the new arrival. Once born, the child was quickly baptized, often within days, because mothers feared that if the infant died unbaptized, their soul might be lost. For the mother, this early ritual was both spiritual and protective. Holding her baby wrapped in simple linen, she would carry them to the parish church, her heart filled with both hope and fear. After baptism, care meant constant attention. The baby was swaddled, held close, and breastfed on demand. Mothers often slept with their infants at their side, not in separate cradles, but on straw beds under woolen blankets. The warmth of her body was the child's best protection against cold nights. Imagine the rhythm of a mother's voice, humming softly as she rocked her baby. The firelight glowed faintly on the child's tiny features while the wind outside rattled the wooden shutters. In these quiet moments, the medieval peasant mother gave all she could, Her warmth, her milk, her prayers. When a child survived infancy and began to walk and talk, the role of the mother shifted. These toddlers were both a joy and an added burden, for now they needed guidance, not only protection. The cottage, small and filled with tools, pots, and animals, could be dangerous. Mothers had to watch their little ones closely to prevent them from tumbling into the hearth or wandering outside unsupervised. Sometimes, when working in the fields, mothers tied their children near them, leaving them within eyesight as they bent to plant seeds or gather herbs. Play was not a separate activity from work. A child might be given a stick to imitate their mother's stirring of the pot, or a small bundle of wool to help with spinning. Through imitation, children absorbed their mother's world. By the age of 3 or 4, children began to take on very small chores, gathering kindling, carrying water in tiny pots, shoeing chickens, or helping their mothers weed gardens. Mothers instructed with patience, but also with urgency, for every pair of hands mattered in the fragile economy of survival. Even at this age, mothers instilled discipline. A child who disobeyed might be scolded sharply or tapped with a hand. Harshness, by modern standards, was simply part of survival. Children were expected to listen, to respect, and to learn quickly. Yet, beneath this sternness, there was care. Mothers might comfort their little ones with stories whispered by the hearth. Tales of saints, of miracles, of old folk legends about spirits in the woods or fairies in the fields. These stories were more than entertainment. They were warnings, lessons, and comforts all woven together. Picture a tired child, curled on their mother's lap at the end of the day, drifting to sleep as she recited a prayer or murmured a tale she had heard from her grandmother. Her rough hands stroked the child's hair gently, her eyes staring into the firelight, carrying the weight of tomorrow's labors, but for this moment offering simple love. By the age of 6 or 7, children were no longer seen as babies. A mother's treatment of them shifted once more, towards preparing them for adult life. For boys, this often meant following their fathers into fields or workshops, but mothers still shaped them in countless ways. Girls, especially, remained close to their mothers. They learned to spin, weave, sew, cook, and tend younger siblings. A mother would guide her daughter's hands through the delicate task of threading a needle, correcting her posture as she stirred a pot, or showing her how to knead bread with steady rhythm. Boys, though often under their father's eye, were still corrected by mothers in manners, faith, and household duties. A mother might scold a son for idleness, remind him to cross himself before meals, or send him to gather herbs while she worked. This period was also when mothers passed on traditions, songs sung while working, prayers to say in times of fear, charms against illness. Children carried these lessons for life, long after their mothers had gone. By 12 or so, medieval children were often considered near adults, and mothers treated them as such. Daughters might already be spoken of in terms of marriage prospects. Sons might be apprenticed to trades or sent as laborers. For mothers, this stage carried both pride and sorrow. Pride in seeing their children contribute, and sorrow in knowing childhood ended so early. A mother's words at this time became more serious, more directive, as she impressed upon her children the importance of faith, duty, and endurance. Yet affection did not vanish. Even as teenagers took on harder work, mothers continued to offer care in quieter ways, patching torn clothes, saving bits of food, or whispering blessings before a child left the home. From the cradle to early adulthood, a peasant mother's treatment of her children was shaped by necessity. But beneath the labor, the discipline, and the hardships, there was always a steady current of love. The bond was forged in shared work, in whispered prayers, in the long nights by the hearth. It was not the modern love of toys or comforts. It was a love of survival, of sacrifice, of giving everything she had so her children might have a chance to grow. And so, each stage of life reflected this. Infancy wrapped in warmth and prayer, childhood guided by chores and discipline, adolescence shaped by preparation for independence. A mother's hands, roughened by toil, held her children through every step. Let us return to that world once more, as if walking softly into the smoky warmth of a medieval cottage. The sound of a crackling fire fills your ears. You can almost smell the mix of smoke, damp earth, and boiling herbs. Here, the peasant mother continues her unending task of keeping her children safe in an environment that was often anything but safe. A medieval peasant's home was modest, often only one room, its walls of wattle and daub, its roof thatched with straw. The floor might be packed earth. In winter it was cold and drafty. In summer it was stifling and filled with flies. Yet for all its discomforts, this cottage was the center of the mother's world, the place where she raised her children. She arranged sleeping spaces carefully. Straw mattresses covered with rough linen were shared by several children, sometimes alongside the mother herself. Infants were kept close to prevent them from rolling into the fire or being crushed by larger siblings. At night, the glow of embers served as both warmth and light. The mother often dozed lightly, ears attuned to the breathing of her children, ready to stir if one coughed or cried out. She made the home safer in small ways. Sharp tools were hung on walls, pots pulled back from curious hands. When she worked with knives, she kept children busy nearby, sometimes handing them dull objects to play with, wooden spoons, pieces of cloth, or small carved toys. Danger could not be eliminated, but it could be managed. Much of a mother's treatment of her children revolved around food. Hunger was a constant shadow, especially in poor harvest years. Mothers prioritized children whenever food was scarce, giving them portions before taking her own. Bread, pottage made of grains and vegetables, and sometimes cheese or eggs formed the diet. Meat was rare, and mothers saved scraps for the youngest mouths. During lean months, she sought wild foods to stretch meals. Nettles, berries, nuts, and roots were gathered with children by her side. She taught them which plants were safe and which dangerous, pointing out the difference between edible herbs and poisonous ones. In this way, her role as provider and teacher intertwined. When a child was ill, food became medicine. Warm broth might be prepared, mixed with herbs like sage or garlic to drive away sickness. Honey soothed throats. A mother's gentle hand held the spoon, coaxing her child to eat even when their strength was weak. Mothers clothed their children in garments she often remade from worn adult clothes. Old tunics were cut down, patched, and sewn anew. A daughter might wear her mother's faded dress, shortened and altered, while a son might inherit a tunic once belonging to an uncle. Shoes were precious, often passed down or repaired until they could no longer hold together. A mother reminded children to keep their clothes clean and dry, for dampness brought chills, and chills brought fevers. She dried garments near the hearth, turning them carefully so they would not scorch. When children complained of cold, she wrapped them in whatever spare cloth she had, whispering that warmth was life itself. Life inside the home was not only about comfort, it was also about discipline. In the small space, tempers could flare. Mothers corrected quarrels between siblings quickly, demanding obedience and respect. Disobedience might earn a sharp word, a slap of the hand, or an extra chore. Yet alongside discipline came moral guidance. Mothers instructed their children in Christian virtues, teaching them to respect priests, to pray before meals, and to honor holy days. She led them to church, often with the smallest children clinging to her skirts. She explained sermons in simple words, shaping her children's view of the world as one under God's watchful eye. Prayers were repeated nightly by the hearth. Even young children learned to murmur the Ave Maria or Pater Noster, their small voices joining their mother's steady tone. For the mother, this was not only piety, it was protection. To raise children in the faith was to secure their souls as well as their bodies. In a world filled with labor and struggle, the mother's voice was a constant presence. She used it to instruct, to discipline, but also to soothe. Lullabies, soft and simple, calmed restless children. Folk songs, carried from one generation to another, entertained during long evenings. Imagine the flicker of firelight, the hum of a mother's voice weaving through the smoky air, her children's eyes heavy with sleep. Her songs reminded them that, even in poverty and hardship, there was comfort in her care. Sickness was perhaps the greatest threat to peasant children. Mothers watched constantly for signs of fever, rashes, or weakness. They used remedies drawn from herbs: chamomile for fevers, garlic for infections, elderflower for coughs. She whispered charms alongside prayers, for in her world, medicine and faith blended seamlessly. When illness spread through the village, mothers lived in fear. Plague, pox, or even a simple fever could take a child quickly. If one child sickened, she tended them tirelessly, wiping sweat from their brow, praying aloud, sometimes sitting through sleepless nights. The grief of losing a child was heavy, yet mothers continued to care for the living, pouring their love into those who remained. Beyond illness, there were dangers from animals, accidents, or even hunger itself. A mother taught children to respect the fire, to keep away from oxen, to beware of rivers. Her warnings, stern and repeated, were acts of love. Every word was meant to keep her children alive in a world that offered few second chances. Despite the hardships, affection flowed between mothers and children. A hand smoothing tangled hair, a kiss pressed to a fevered forehead, a small treat saved from the day's work, all revealed the deep bond. The medieval peasant mother may have been stern, but her treatment of her children was rooted in love shaped by survival. The cottage, with its smoke and shadows, bore witness to countless such moments: discipline and tenderness, fear and comfort, survival and devotion. Once again, let us walk softly back into the 13th and 14th centuries. The fire inside the peasant cottage flickers low, and now, picture the mother leading her children outside, into the fields, into the village lanes, into the heart of medieval England's daily life. For the treatment of children was not confined to the four walls of the home. It extended into the soil they tilled, the churchyard where they prayed, and the village commons where they worked and played. From an early age, peasant children were drawn into agricultural life, and mothers were their first guides. She showed them how to gather herbs, how to pick up sticks for fuel, and how to scatter grain to feed chickens. By the time they were strong enough to carry small tools, they followed her into the open fields. A mother's voice was ever present, giving gentle instruction, sometimes sharp correction, sometimes encouragement. "Hold the bundle tighter," she might say. Or, "Keep your eyes open for stones in the furrows." For every mistake a child made risked lost crops or wasted effort, and in a household balanced on the edge of survival, no labor could be wasted. Still, she often balanced correction with affection. When little hands grew sore from gathering, she might pause, wipe the dirt from a child's face, and offer a crust of bread from her pouch. In these moments, the bond between mother and child deepened through shared work. The seasons dictated the rhythm of a mother's treatment. In spring, she taught children to help plant seeds, dropping peas into furrows, patting the earth gently with their small hands. In summer, she guided them in weeding and scaring birds away from ripening grain. In autumn, during the great harvest, she relied on every child, even the youngest, to gather, bind, and carry. In winter, when fields lay bare, she brought children into the cottage for spinning, weaving, and mending tasks. Her treatment then turned toward patience and instruction. Girls learned to spin wool on simple spindles. Boys might be taught to carve wooden pegs or repair baskets. These were long months, and she used them to fill her children's hands with skills. The seasons themselves became teachers, but it was always the mother who stood beside her children, showing them how to live within their cycle. Beyond the home and field lay the village itself, a tight-knit community where every child was known, and every mother was watched. A peasant mother's treatment of her children was shaped not only by her own will but by the expectations of neighbors. If her child misbehaved in public, stealing fruit, swearing, or showing disrespect, shame fell not only on the child but on her as well. Thus, mothers kept a careful watch in communal spaces. She scolded quickly when her children ran too far or played too rough. She reminded them to remove their caps in churchyards, to greet elders respectfully, and to mind their tongues. Such guidance was constant, for reputation in the village mattered deeply, and children reflected their mother's worth. At times, she also relied on the wider community. Older children might be sent to help a neighbor with animals or errands. Mothers trusted that discipline would be maintained elsewhere, for village life was shared life, and the upbringing of children was, in part, a communal duty. Much of a child's education under a mother's care came not through words but through watching. Daughters watched mothers milk cows, mend garments, prepare meals, and manage the household. Sons observed as she traded at market, measured out grain, or negotiated with neighbors. Mothers treated this observation as training. She might quietly point out good behavior. See how she kneads the bread with steady hands, or use sharp examples as warnings. Do not grow lazy like him, or you will go hungry. Her treatment was not only affectionate, it was practical, shaping children's minds to notice, imitate, and learn. Though work dominated, mothers understood the need for play. Children could not labor from dawn to dusk without pause. During breaks, mothers allowed games, chasing one another across meadows, tossing balls of rags, or playing at catch the stick. A mother might even smile at their laughter, though she rarely joined in herself. Yet she watched. If games grew too wild, she called them back, reminding them not to waste time or hurt themselves. Play was tolerated, even encouraged, but always framed within the boundaries of responsibility. In this balance, her treatment of children was revealed. She allowed joy, but never at the expense of duty. On market days, mothers often took children along. These trips were both necessity and education. A child at her side learned to observe prices, to weigh bread against coin, to see how neighbors bargained. A mother held her child's hand firmly in the crowded lanes, warning against pickpockets and urging them to stay close. Sometimes she gave her older child a small task, carrying eggs in a basket, holding a cloth bundle, or even speaking a simple trade under her supervision. These acts were lessons, preparing children to manage households of their own one day. A mother's treatment here was tender but firm, protective against dangers, but instructive in the art of survival through exchange. In the broader village life, faith shaped every mother's words and actions. On feast days, she dressed her children as neatly as possible, smoothing their hair, tying belts, and making sure their faces were washed. She urged them to sit quietly in church, to listen to the priest, and to bow at holy moments. Afterwards, she might explain the sermon in her own words, often through stories. "You must forgive," she would say, "just as we are forgiven." In her treatment, moral and spiritual lessons were inseparable from daily chores. Everywhere, fields, lanes, churchyards, the mother's presence was watchful. She noticed dirt on hands, tears in clothing, small acts of kindness, and small acts of mischief. Her corrections could be swift, but her praise was not absent. A child who worked diligently might receive a smile, a kind word, or a little extra food from the pot. In this way, children grew under her gaze, shaped not only by labor but by constant observation. To be a peasant child in medieval England was to live always under the shadow and shelter of a mother's care. Thus, in the world outside the cottage, the fields, the markets, the village lanes, a mother's treatment of her children was guiding, correcting, and protecting, always with an eye toward survival and honor. As we move further into the long rhythm of medieval peasant life, we see that a mother's role in raising her children was both tender and practical, steeped in customs that had been passed down through generations. These women had little room for idle sentiment. Their love was expressed through labor, instruction, and survival strategies. To understand their relationship with their children, we must step into their cottages, hear the crackle of the hearth, and feel the damp earth beneath their wooden clogs. Daily life for children revolved around imitation. By the age of 5 or 6, a child was not simply playing. He or she was expected to begin contributing in some way to the family's work. A mother would carefully teach her daughters the arts of spinning, weaving, mending, and tending to the household animals. For sons, the lessons were about carrying water, chopping wood, or assisting in the fields. These teachings were not delivered with gentle schooling as we imagine today, but with the constant presence of a watchful mother who corrected mistakes sharply, knowing that errors in spinning thread or storing grain could mean hardship for the whole family. Food preparation was another sphere where mothers trained their children. Girls stood beside their mothers, learning to grind grain on the quern stone, to mix coarse bread dough, and to keep watch over the bubbling pottage pot that simmered on the fire. This food, often thin, watery, and repetitive, was not a matter of preference but survival. Mothers reminded their children not to waste a scrap, often with proverbs passed down from their own mothers, instilling both gratitude and caution. Mothers also served as the first healers in their children's lives. In a world where physicians were rare and costly, peasants relied on folk remedies. A mother would gather herbs from the hedgerows, plantain for cuts, chamomile for fevers, and nettles for cleansing the blood. Her children were expected to learn the knowledge of plants by watching her carefully. Sometimes she murmured charms or prayers as she worked, blending Christian faith with older traditions. Her children absorbed this quiet mixture of medicine and belief, carrying it into their own adulthood. Religion was woven into the relationship as well. Mothers ensured that children learned their prayers, often reciting the Paternoster or Ave Maria together before bed or at dawn. For many peasant families, the rhythm of the church calendar guided daily life. Fasting days, feast days, saints' festivals, and mothers were the ones who introduced children to these customs. It was less about theology and more about routine, reminding them to cross themselves, to respect holy days, and to obey the moral codes expected of Christians in their parish. Discipline, too, was part of a mother's duty. Harsh punishments were common, not out of cruelty but necessity. A wandering child who strayed too far could risk drowning in a mill pond, being trampled by livestock, or drawing the attention of strangers. Therefore, mothers corrected disobedience quickly, often with the rod or a sharp word, believing that strictness was a form of protection. To modern ears it may sound severe, but within their world, survival outweighed indulgence. Seasonal changes brought shifts in motherly care. In spring, children were taken to the fields to help scare birds from newly planted seeds, sometimes with wooden clappers. In summer, children joined the hay harvest, carrying small bundles or helping with grazing animals. In autumn, they assisted with gathering nuts, berries, and firewood. Through all these activities, mothers stood close, guiding their little ones with watchful eyes and steady hands. Winter, however, brought long evenings by the fire, when mothers told stories, legends of saints, local folk tales, and sometimes cautionary tales to instill obedience and moral lessons. These moments, softened by the glow of the hearth, allowed tenderness to flow more freely than in the busyness of summer. A child's clothing and cleanliness also fell under a mother's care. Clothes were rough, often patched many times, and made of wool or linen. Mothers taught daughters the art of mending, how to turn a worn shirt inside out, reinforce torn seams, or weave in new thread where fabric had frayed. Washing was infrequent, but mothers instructed children in the basics of tidiness, scrubbing hands before meals, keeping hair free of lice when possible, and ensuring bedding was shaken out and dried near the fire. Even in poverty, these small lessons helped maintain dignity. We can also observe that motherhood was shared across the village community. Other women, grandmothers, aunts, neighbors, often played a role in a child's upbringing. A peasant mother relied on this support, as she herself may have been called to the fields or required to help with seasonal labor. Thus, her children learned not only from her but also from the women around them, absorbing a collective culture of care, discipline, and survival skills. In all these ways, the bond between medieval peasant mothers and their children was a complex weaving of necessity, faith, love, and endurance. Though affection may not have been expressed in the sentimental ways modern families expect, it was there. In the food placed on the table, the cloak patched one more time, the whispered prayer over a sleeping child. Mothers built their children's futures with quiet, relentless effort, shaping them into adults who could carry forward the weight of medieval life. Let us now step deeper into the lived atmosphere of a medieval peasant household, focusing on the subtler day-to-day ways in which mothers nurtured and guided their children. To truly sense this, imagine a small timber-framed cottage, smoke curling from the hearth, the earthy smell of rushes spread across the floor, and the hum of quiet work as the day unfolds. Mothers were the first teachers of responsibility. In a world where resources were scarce, they trained their children to value labor from an early age. A boy might be given the task of carrying a bucket of water from the village well, while a girl was taught how to spin rough wool into usable thread. Mothers watched closely, correcting clumsy hands, repeating instructions until the movement became second nature. Their voices were not always gentle. A sharp scold was often quicker than patient explanation. Yet, beneath that firmness lay the knowledge that these small tasks were survival skills, as essential as learning to walk or speak. The rhythm of the day shaped the mother-child relationship. Dawn came early in the medieval countryside, and mothers woke children with the sound of rattling pots or the scrape of a stool across the stone floor. Breakfast was plain, usually coarse bread dipped in ale or pottage from the night before. A mother would see to it that each child ate something before work began, though portions were modest. The act of feeding children, even sparingly, was one of the most constant expressions of maternal care. Hunger was a companion in many homes, and mothers often went without so their children could eat. Education in the formal sense was rare, especially among peasants, yet mothers were responsible for teaching the skills of communication. They passed down proverbs, riddles, and songs, which carried practical wisdom and moral lessons. A lullaby might not only soothe a restless child, but also embed in their memory the rhythm of language and the values of their community. These oral traditions became the building blocks of a child's understanding of the world. Religious instruction was also a key part of mothering. A mother taught her children to cross themselves, to kneel in prayer, and to recognize holy symbols. Even when the priest delivered sermons in Latin, a language peasants did not understand, mothers explained in their own simple words what faith required. They used stories of saints and biblical figures as examples, teaching lessons of patience, humility, or obedience. These lessons were often reinforced by ritual: the lighting of a candle, the marking of the sign of the cross on a child's forehead before bed, or the insistence that children attend Mass with the family. Seasons, once again, dictated the kinds of lessons children received. In spring, mothers guided their children into the fields, showing them how to sow seeds carefully into furrows, how to tread lightly so as not to crush the tender shoots. In summer, mothers supervised children who helped herd animals, teaching them to keep an eye on wandering sheep or stubborn cows. Autumn brought harvest tasks. Mothers trained children to glean fallen grain, gathering what might otherwise be wasted. Winter, long and hard, brought indoor work, learning to mend, weave, and prepare food stores. Each season reinforced the bond between mother and child through shared labor. We should also consider the emotional side of this relationship. Though not recorded in chronicles with much detail, small acts reveal a mother's affection. A mother might place a hand on her child's shoulder as they prayed, hum softly while they spun wool together, or hush a crying infant with a rhythmic rocking beside the fire. There was little opportunity for indulgence in toys or luxuries, but mothers sometimes carved simple playthings, like a wooden doll or a bundle of rags made into a ball, or allowed children to chase each other in the village green while she kept watch. These brief moments of play were as close to leisure as many peasant children came. Illness and death were constant shadows in the medieval world, and here the role of mothers was most profound. When a child fell ill, a mother stayed close, applying poultices, brewing bitter herbal teas, and whispering prayers over the small body. Sometimes, despite her efforts, the illness would take its course, and mothers carried the grief quietly, returning to their work because life demanded it. Yet, when her remedies succeeded, the gratitude in her heart reinforced her role as protector and healer. Another important detail is that mothers shaped children's manners and place within the community. They instructed them to greet elders respectfully, to help neighbors when called upon, and to understand the unspoken rules of the village. A misstep could bring shame upon the family, and so mothers carefully taught children how to behave in public, when to speak, and when to remain silent. It is worth noting, too, that medieval peasant mothers did not raise their children alone. The village was a collective environment. While a mother carried primary responsibility, other women, neighbors, midwives, and even older children, took part in the care of the youngest. This shared motherhood created a safety net of sorts, though it did not lessen the mother's central role. In sum, the medieval peasant mother's treatment of her children was both practical and deeply human. She prepared them for a life of hardship, but she also gave them comfort, faith, and the tools to endure. Her guidance came through discipline and routine, but her quiet tenderness revealed itself in small gestures, whispered words, and enduring presence. Through her, children inherited not only survival skills but also the resilience of the generations before them. Picture the soft crackle of a low fire on a damp English morning. The mist clings to the fields, and within a small wattle-and daub cottage, a mother draws her children closer, not only to keep them warm but also to remind them of their place in the household. At the heart of a peasant mother's treatment of her children was order. Life could not afford disorder. There was no room for laziness, no space for idleness. From a very young age, children were expected to fit into the working rhythm of the family. Mothers instilled this discipline with gentle nudges or, at times, sharper tones. A child lingering too long by the doorway when the goats needed tending might hear their mother's firm voice calling them back to duty. She did not act from harshness, but from the knowledge that every task mattered, every moment carried weight. The medieval mother's treatment was also shaped by scarcity. Food was never guaranteed, and when harvests failed, the burden fell heavily on mothers. It was often they who quietly reduced their own portions, ensuring that their children received enough to survive. Imagine a mother tearing her bread in half, passing the larger piece to her little one while she pretended she was not hungry. Such sacrifices were silent, yet they spoke of a devotion deeper than words. Cleanliness, though limited by the time, was another responsibility mothers carried. They washed their children's faces with cold water drawn from the well, combed through hair to remove lice, and patched rough garments so a child would not walk bare in the cold. To modern eyes, these might seem meager acts, but in the medieval setting, they were labors of care. A child who was not kept clean might be mocked, and so a mother shielded her children from such shame by whatever small means she could manage. Discipline itself was a blend of firmness and affection. A wooden spoon might be tapped on a table as a warning, or a raised voice might correct disobedience. At times, physical punishment was part of child-rearing, as it was accepted across medieval society. Yet, mothers balanced correction with reassurance. After the scold came the reminder of love, a bowl of warm pottage, a hand smoothing over tangled hair, or a whispered prayer for the child's future. This duality was central, to guide children firmly, but to keep their hearts bound in loyalty to the family. Playfulness, too, was not absent. Though life was harsh, children found joy in simple games, and mothers often encouraged these brief respites. They might allow their children to chase chickens in the yard, play with a hoop fashioned from a bent branch, or roll a leather ball stitched crudely by hand. A mother watching from the doorway, spindle in hand, smiled as she saw laughter ripple through her little ones, for even in poverty, childhood carried moments of delight. The bond of mothers with their daughters deserves special attention. Daughters were, in many ways, their mother's shadow. From the age of 4 or 5, a girl followed her mother, imitating her work, fetching small items, holding the spindle, stirring the pot. Mothers treated their daughters as apprentices to womanhood, teaching not only household chores but also the subtler arts. How to greet neighbors, how to barter in the market, how to stretch food supplies when times grew lean. This treatment was both practical training and preparation for the day when daughters would one day run households of their own. Sons received different attention. Though fathers often took the lead in training boys for fieldwork, mothers shaped their early years. They treated their young sons with a mixture of tenderness and urgency, aware that these boys would soon be called upon to labor beside men in the fields. A mother's treatment, then, involved preparing them to be strong, patient, and obedient. She taught them prayers, guided their small hands when handling tools, and reminded them to respect the rhythm of the land. Religious observance, again, was central to maternal care. Mothers urged their children to kneel at night, to repeat prayers, to attend feast days and processions. When a child erred, a mother might remind them of divine judgment, encouraging obedience not only to her but also to God. This intertwining of motherhood and faith was powerful, shaping how children viewed authority and morality. Mothers also created an atmosphere of security. In a world of uncertainty, where famine, war, or disease might strike without warning, the home was a place of stability. A child, returning from hours spent in the fields, found reassurance in the sight of their mother tending the hearth, her presence anchoring the household. Her very routine, The turning of the bread on the fire, the steady rhythm of her spindle, the soft cadence of her voice, built a sense of order that children carried with them into adulthood. At times, mothers served as mediators between children and fathers. A stern father might scold too harshly, and it was often the mother who softened his words afterward, explaining them in gentler tones to the children. This balancing role reveals the subtle ways mothers treated their children, not only with discipline but also with emotional cushioning, allowing them to withstand the harder edges of peasant life. Thus, in batch after batch of these glimpses, we see the recurring truth. Medieval peasant mothers treated their children with a blend of discipline, sacrifice, faith, and small joys. Their love was not displayed in grand gestures, but in the ceaseless, ordinary acts of keeping children alive, prepared, and rooted in the life of the village. Let us continue slowly, as if we are walking through the misty lanes of a medieval English village, hearing the low murmur of mothers guiding their little ones. The life of a peasant child was never separate from the life of the community, and mothers played the role of gentle, and sometimes stern guides, leading their children through the seasonal rhythms and rituals that shaped medieval existence. From the earliest days, children were introduced to seasonal work, and mothers were their instructors. In spring, when fields needed sowing, a mother placed seeds in her child's hand, showing them how to scatter carefully, not wastefully, into the earth. She explained the importance of each kernel, reminding them that a careless hand might mean hunger come winter. The treatment was firm but imbued with a sense of sacred duty, for mothers taught children to see the soil not just as dirt, but as the very fabric of survival. By summer, children found themselves outdoors for longer hours, herding animals or helping with hay. A mother's voice echoed across the fields, reminding her children not to wander too far, not to lose sight of the sheep, to keep close watch. She treated these tasks as training, sometimes rewarding diligence with small kindnesses, an extra hunk of bread, a kind word by the fire, teaching her children that labor was both expected and praised. Autumn was a season of intensity. Harvest time called all hands to work, even the smallest. Mothers guided their children to glean, to collect the stray ears of grain left behind after reaping. This was a vital practice for poor families, and a mother's treatment here was one of urgency, teaching children to work quickly, to value every scrap of food. She might carry an infant on her hip while directing older children, weaving her care for each child into the very rhythm of gathering food. Winter, though, was the season when mother's nurturing presence was felt most. Children remained indoors more often, and mothers filled their days with quiet lessons. A daughter might learn how to spin by her mother's side, watching the spindle turn, listening to the hum of her mother's voice. A son might be taught to mend small items, or to carve wood for simple household tools. The treatment here was patient, repetitive, and purposeful. Mothers knew that survival through the long cold depended on children acquiring these practical skills. Beyond labor, mothers introduced their children to the rituals of faith. On feast days, mothers ensured that children were clean and properly dressed, even if it meant scrubbing with cold water before dawn. She would smooth her daughter's hair, tighten her son's belt, and walk with them to the churchyard, guiding them through prayers and hymns. Mothers treated these occasions as more than obligation. They were teaching their children to be part of something greater than themselves. The pageantry of the church, the candles, incense, and chants, was filtered through a mother's explanations at home, where she told stories of saints and holy days by the hearth. Village festivals, too, were moments when mothers shaped their children's sense of belonging. During midsummer celebrations, children danced in the green with other villagers, and mothers watched carefully, calling out instructions, reminding them not to stray too far or act unruly. At harvest festivals, mothers taught their children to offer gratitude, often encouraging them to share what little food they had with neighbors. This treatment was communal, emphasizing generosity and cooperation. Illness and hardship were constant presences, and here the mother's role deepened. A feverish child was cradled in a mother's lap, wrapped in blankets, soothed with herbal remedies made from plants she had gathered. A poultice of garlic, a tea brewed from chamomile or sage. These were the medicines mothers administered, whispering prayers as they worked. Children learn through this care not only to trust their mothers but also to recognize the herbs, the remedies, and the rituals themselves. When misfortune struck, a poor harvest, a cruel winter, the death of livestock, it was often the mother who explained these events to her children. Her words softened the harshness of reality, giving meaning to loss, teaching endurance. She might tell them that God was testing their strength, or that hard times were a chance to grow in patience. These lessons, though shaped by hardship, were ways mothers treated their children with both honesty and hope. Even in times of joy, mothers created space for children's delight. During Yuletide, a mother might allow her children to enjoy small luxuries, perhaps a little honeyed bread, or a game played by the hearth with carved wooden pieces. Though resources were scarce, these moments of joy, permitted and encouraged by mothers, left strong imprints in children's memories. They learned that life was not only toil and worry, but also moments of laughter and comfort, granted by their mother's care. The mother's role was not always tender. At times, it was edged with severity. Disobedience or laziness was quickly corrected, sometimes with a slap, sometimes with stern words. Yet such treatment was understood as necessary. A child who shirked duties endangered not just themselves, but the family's survival. Mothers bore this burden with a heavy heart, knowing that firmness today might secure survival tomorrow. And so, as the cycles of the seasons turned, medieval peasant mothers guided their children through a life where every act had meaning. Through labor, ritual, faith, discipline, and small joys, mothers taught their children how to endure, how to belong, and how to carry forward the traditions of their people. Their treatment was not defined by indulgence, but by necessity. Not by luxury, but by resilience. Now let us slow our minds, as if listening to the faint hum of a lullaby carried across the straw-strewn floor of a peasant cottage. Though the world of medieval peasants was often shaped by toil, hunger, and hardship, mothers found ways to weave tenderness into their children's lives. These softer moments may not have been written in the grand chronicles of kings and battles, but they lived in the hearts of the children who grew beneath their mother's care. At night, when work was done and the hearth burned low, mothers gathered their children near. She might cradle a small one in her arms, rocking gently, her voice weaving simple lullabies. These songs were not elaborate, but carried soothing rhythms, chants of faith, proverbs hidden in rhyme, or melodies remembered from her own mother. A child, drowsy and comforted, drifted into sleep to the sound of a mother's voice, the words embedding not only peace but also the wisdom of generations. In this way, mothers treated their children with both comfort and instruction, even in the act of calming them. Tenderness was not confined to nightfall. In daylight, when small injuries came, scraped knees from chasing chickens, cuts from gathering wood, a mother soothed with both herbs and touch. She rinsed the wound, applied a poultice of plantain or honey, then whispered words of reassurance. Her treatment was practical but wrapped in affection, reminding the child that, though the world outside was harsh, the warmth of her presence was steady. Children, especially the youngest, sought their mothers for comfort in fear. A sudden storm, a loud noise in the village, or a quarrel between adults, these unsettled the young. A mother drew her children close, her hand smoothing over hair, her body forming a barrier against the chaos. This physical act of protection was a silent message. Here, in her arms, was safety. Mothers also expressed care through storytelling. By the fire, they told children tales of saints, of travelers, of ancient heroes. Sometimes these stories were practical, lessons wrapped in narrative, warning against laziness or praising virtues like honesty. At other times, they were meant to spark wonder, to remind children that life held mysteries beyond the village walls. A child, listening wide-eyed, learned not only about the world but also about the heart of their mother, who gave them time, voice, and imagination despite her weariness. For daughters, tenderness took on the form of gentle apprenticeship. A mother placed her child's hand over her own on the spindle, guiding the fingers patiently until the motion became smooth. She praised effort more than success, offering encouragement even when thread snapped or wool tangled. This treatment gave daughters a sense of competence and belonging. They were not only loved but trusted with the tasks of womanhood. For sons, the mother's tenderness was often shown in how she released them into the world. Though boys were called earlier into fieldwork, a mother still fussed over them, mending their tunics, tying their belts tightly, pressing food into their hands before they left the cottage. It was her way of saying, "I care, even if I cannot follow you into the fields." In her heart, she carried worry, for accidents, illness or hardship might await, but her treatment showed quiet strength, never burdening the child with her fears. When resources allowed, mothers gave small tokens of love. A rag doll, stitched from scraps, was handed to a daughter. A carved whistle, whittled by father but given through mother's hands, was offered to a son. Such objects, though simple, carried great meaning, reminders that even amid poverty, love could take physical form. Tenderness also appeared in how mothers managed hunger. When food was scarce, they disguised meagerness with care. A thin broth was stirred longer, so that the smell filled the cottage and gave comfort. Bread crusts were softened in warm milk, offered with the same dignity as a feast. Mothers often took less for themselves, placing the best portions in the hands of their children, smiling as though it were natural. The treatment here was sacrifice cloaked in normalcy. Children rarely saw the hunger their mothers bore. Even discipline, when softened by love, became an act of tenderness. After scolding, a mother might draw her child back to her side, reminding them with touch or whispered word that correction did not mean rejection. She balanced firmness with reassurance, shaping children to understand both boundaries and belonging. The emotional bond was strengthened, too, by the sheer constancy of the mother's presence. In every season, in every hour, she was there. Whether spinning, baking, or tending animals, her children circled around her. They learned trust through her reliability. A child who woke in the night to the sound of rain knew their mother was nearby. A child who stumbled in fear knew they could run back to her. This unspoken security was itself a form of treatment, anchoring the child against the instability of the outside world. In all these ways, mothers in medieval England treated their children with a mixture of stern necessity and deep tenderness. Though survival often required discipline and hard labor, mothers found moments to offer comfort, love, and security. Their touch, their voices, their small sacrifices shaped the emotional lives of children in ways that endured long after childhood faded. Imagine once again the soft crackling of a hearth in a low, timber-framed cottage, the shadows flickering on walls plastered with clay. Around this fire, a medieval peasant mother not only nurtured her children but also prepared them for the time when they would step beyond her care. Childhood was short, and mothers treated their sons and daughters with a constant awareness that they must be ready for the demands of adulthood much sooner than we imagine today. From the earliest years, mothers instilled in daughters the expectations of marriage and household management. A girl, from the age of 5 or 6, was not simply a child but a future wife and mother in training. Mothers guided their daughters into the skills that would secure a husband and keep a household running: spinning, weaving, cooking, and even the management of a small garden plot. She was taught to knead bread patiently, to measure ingredients by hand, to stretch what little they had so that nothing went to waste. A mother might scold her daughter for spilling grain or burning bread, not out of cruelty, but out of urgency. These mistakes in adult life could mean hunger. The treatment was practical, preparing daughters for survival in a world where competence in domestic tasks was as valuable as beauty or charm. Mothers also treated their daughters with advice on modesty and behavior. A girl was taught how to carry herself in the village, how to speak respectfully, how to avoid gossip or frivolous behavior that might damage her reputation. A peasant girl's chances for a respectable marriage depended not only on her family's standing but also on her conduct, and mothers were keenly aware of this. A raised eyebrow, a warning tone, or even a quiet reminder before a feast day gathering, all were ways a mother guided her daughter toward propriety. Sons, in turn, were treated with preparation for field labor and eventual service. While fathers often oversaw the physical work of training boys in plowing, sowing, and herding, mothers contributed by instilling discipline and responsibility. A boy's first duties, fetching water, gathering firewood, tending small animals, were supervised by his mother. She reminded him of the importance of these tasks, treating small responsibilities as stepping stones toward manhood. In addition, mothers shaped their sons' moral and religious upbringing. A mother's firm voice might caution a boy against idleness or theft, reminding him that sin carried not only earthly shame but divine punishment. She prayed over her sons, teaching them to respect elders, priests, and neighbors. When disputes arose among village boys, it was often a mother who stepped in, disciplining her son while also reminding him of forgiveness and humility. In this way, mothers treated their sons not only as laborers in training but as future men whose honor would reflect upon the family. For both sons and daughters, mothers carried the responsibility of introducing them to service outside the home. Many peasant children, upon reaching adolescence, entered service in wealthier households, monasteries, or estates. Mothers prepared them for this transition by teaching obedience, respect, and endurance. She might remind a daughter to be loyal to her mistress, to work diligently, to maintain modesty in all things. She might warn a son to honor his master's word, to remain strong in labor, to avoid trouble with fellow servants. The treatment here was careful and sobering. Mothers knew that once their children left the cottage, their survival would depend on these virtues. Marriage was another subject of maternal guidance. Though peasant marriages were often shaped by family alliances, village custom, or lordly approval, mothers played a quiet but influential role in preparing daughters for married life. They whispered advice about keeping peace in a household, about bearing children, about tending to a husband's needs. To sons, mothers offered counsel about the responsibilities of providing for a wife and family, reminding them of the toil they had witnessed from their own fathers. This guidance was not always gentle. It was often blunt, shaped by the harsh realities of peasant life. But in its honesty it was a form of care. Mothers also shaped their children's understanding of death and continuity. In a world where mortality was high, children saw siblings, neighbors, and even parents die young. Mothers treated their children with both realism and comfort, explaining death as part of God's will, teaching them prayers for the dead, and encouraging resilience. A child who lost a sibling was comforted by a mother's words, even as she herself carried her grief silently. This treatment prepared children for a world where loss was inevitable, and endurance was essential. Beyond preparation for adulthood, mothers offered children the strength of example. By watching their mothers work endlessly, tending the fire, mending clothes, bargaining at market, children learned what resilience looked like. They saw patience in her quiet endurance, faith in her whispered prayers, and authority in her commands. Without formal lessons, mothers treated their children by embodying the very virtues they hoped to pass on. And so, in the final shaping years of childhood, medieval peasant mothers treated their children with both stern guidance and quiet compassion, knowing that their time under her wing was short. Whether preparing a daughter for marriage or a son for fieldwork, her treatment was directed toward one purpose: equipping them for survival and dignity in a demanding world. Close your eyes for a moment, and let yourself drift back once again to the flicker of torchlight against rough timber beams, the creak of straw mats beneath tired bodies, and the smell of earth and wood smoke lingering in the small home. Here, within these humble walls, medieval peasant mothers balanced a delicate rhythm, discipline and love woven together like the warp and weft of cloth on a loom. Discipline was not optional. The survival of the family depended on every member, even the smallest child, contributing to daily labor. A mother treated disobedience firmly, for laziness or neglect could bring hunger, wasted effort, or shame to the household. A child sent to fetch water who tarried too long, a daughter distracted from her spinning, or a son who shirked tending animals. All could expect a mother's sharp words or even a slap of the hand. This was not cruelty as we might imagine today. Rather, it was the enforcement of responsibility. Mothers understood that if a child failed to learn discipline within the cottage, life outside its walls would be unforgiving. Yet, beneath this sternness, there was tenderness that rarely left words but lingered in gestures. After scolding a child, a mother might pull them near as they both shared a meal from the same wooden bowl. She might pat her son's head after he carried firewood, or hum softly as she brushed straw from her daughter's hair. The warmth of discipline was not in punishment, but in the quiet assurance that her correction was meant to shape, not to wound. Children often remembered their mother's songs, simple lullabies hummed while stirring pottage or while rocking a baby at dusk. These songs carried lessons too, verses about saints, warnings against mischief, or gentle reminders of God's presence. Even as discipline echoed in daily life, these melodies wrapped children in love. In later years, grown men and women recalled their mother's humming as a sound of safety, a thread of love stretching back into their childhood. The balance between discipline and love was also felt in times of illness. When children fell sick, a frequent shadow in the medieval world, mothers treated them with all the remedies she knew. She boiled herbs, whispered prayers, and pressed cool cloths to fevered brows. Even while scolding her child for drinking unclean water or neglecting chores that brought sickness, her hands were steady with care, her voice softened with worry. Mothers, despite their hardness in daily labor, often spent sleepless nights tending the weak, knowing too well how fragile life could be. Love was often expressed through labor itself. A mother's weaving of a tunic, mending of a cloak, or setting aside the softest bread crust for a child were small, silent acts of care. Unlike the affectionate embraces we may expect today, love in the medieval peasant household was quiet, practical, and sometimes unseen until remembered in later years. A grown daughter, spinning wool by her own hearth, might recall the exact way her mother's hands guided hers, the warmth of that moment standing out against harsher memories. Discipline and love met, too, in teaching values of humility and respect. A mother's voice might rise in anger if a child mocked the poor or disrespected an elder. Yet, the very next moment, she could press a child's hand and explain softly why kindness mattered, why generosity was blessed by God. Mothers did not separate sternness from affection. Rather, they bound them together. To children, the lesson was clear. Love was not indulgence, but guidance shaped by care. In memory, many medieval peasants, once grown, spoke with reverence about their mothers. Even those who remembered sharp words or strict commands often paired those memories with gratitude. They knew their mothers had stood as both guardian and teacher, binding together firmness and affection in a way that made survival possible. A mother's treatment might sting in youth, but it endured as wisdom in adulthood. So, in the quiet rhythm of peasant cottages, mothers gave their children both the hard edges of discipline and the soft warmth of love. The two could not be separated. Like the two blades of a pair of shears, they worked together, cutting away folly while shaping the cloth of character, leaving behind sons and daughters prepared not only for survival but for remembrance. Now, let us step softly into the world of faith and devotion, where medieval peasant mothers guided their children not only through chores and labor, but also through the spiritual rhythms that gave meaning to life. Religion, in medieval England, was not an occasional practice but the very air people breathed. The bells of the parish church marked time. Feast days broke up the weary labor of the year. Prayers whispered at dawn and dusk gave reassurance to hearts that carried heavy burdens. And here, within this web of devotion, mothers became the first teachers of faith. From the earliest days of childhood, mothers whispered prayers into their children's ears. Before a child could even form words, a mother would fold their tiny hands together, guiding them to cross themselves and murmur simple phrases. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The repetition of these rituals shaped not only belief but also comfort. Religion was as natural as breathing, learned as part of the rhythm of daily life. Mothers taught children the fear of sin and the hope of forgiveness. If a child lied, stole an egg, or disrespected kin, a mother would scold them not only for the act but for the stain it left on their soul. She would warn of hellfire, of demons lurking to tempt the careless, but she would also guide the child toward confession, penance, and prayer. In this way, mothers treated misbehavior as not only disobedience to the household but also to God Himself. Spiritual upbringing was also shaped by the church calendar. Mothers drew children into the cycle of fasts and feasts, teaching them when to abstain from meat, when to rejoice with feasting, when to honor saints. During Lent, mothers reminded children of the importance of humility, perhaps giving them smaller portions at meals or teaching them the value of sacrifice. At Christmastide, they shared stories of the Nativity, weaving warmth and wonder into the coldest days of winter. Peasant mothers also turned to folk prayers and protective charms. Though the official teachings of the church frowned upon superstition, village life often blended orthodox prayers with local traditions. A mother might whisper the Pater Noster while tying a ribbon around a child's wrist to ward off illness, or sprinkle holy water over a cradle while also hanging a sprig of herbs nearby. In these acts, mothers expressed deep love. Every prayer, every whispered charm, was meant to shield children from the dangers that hovered so near in a fragile world. Illness and death were frequent visitors in medieval England, and here the mother's spiritual role grew even stronger. A sick child might be wrapped in warmed cloth while a mother prayed to the Virgin Mary or invoked the protection of local saints. If death seemed close, it was often the mother who hurried to fetch holy water, who pressed the sign of the cross over the child's brow, who whispered the final prayers in trembling devotion. These moments revealed the depth of a mother's faith and love. She clung to prayer as fiercely as she clung to the fragile body of her child. Mothers also used moral tales to shape their children's behavior. Around the hearth in the quiet after supper, they would tell stories of saints who resisted temptation, of children who obeyed their parents and were blessed, of sinners who strayed and suffered. These tales were not meant to entertain so much as to instruct, shaping a child's mind as firmly as the mother's hand shaped their daily labor. Religion was not separate from daily work. As daughters spun wool or sons tended animals, mothers reminded them to work as unto God. When bread was baked, a cross might be traced upon the dough. When water was fetched, prayers for purity were whispered. These daily reminders meant that children grew up seeing every action as part of devotion, every task as tied to faith. Through these spiritual lessons, medieval peasant mothers treated their children with a blend of awe and caution. They were not only raising workers for the fields but also souls for eternity. Every scolding, every prayer, every gesture of care was a thread in the tapestry of salvation as they understood it. For mothers, nurturing faith was an act of love as vital as feeding their children. So in the stillness of village nights, as the fire dimmed and shadows stretched across the low rafters, the voice of a mother might still be heard. A whispered prayer over a sleeping child, the quiet murmur of hope that God would guard their little one through the long darkness until morning came again. Now let us lean closer to the soft crackle of the fire, and step into the quieter, often overlooked ways in which medieval peasant mothers shaped the minds of their children. Not through parchment or Latin, but through daily teaching, play, and practical life lessons. Formal schooling was rare for peasant children. The village school or parish priest might sometimes teach a few boys their letters, but for most children, their first and only teacher was their mother. She did not hold a book in her hand, but her classroom was the hearth, the field, and the lane. From their earliest years, children absorbed knowledge by watching their mother's every move. A girl learned how to spin wool by sitting at her mother's side, tiny fingers fumbling with a spindle until, through patience and correction, the thread ran smooth. A boy followed his mother to the garden, where she showed him which herbs healed and which weeds harmed, guiding his hands as he pulled roots from the soil. Learning was not abstract, it was survival. Play was not separate from learning either. Peasant mothers allowed their children to play with sticks, pebbles, or rag dolls stuffed with straw, but these games often mirrored adult tasks. A little girl's doll might be wrapped as a baby, teaching her nurturing habits. A boy's wooden toy plow or cart prepared him for the work of oxen and fields. Mothers encouraged this, sometimes laughing softly at their children's imitation of adult chores, but they knew these playful acts were also practice for real responsibilities. Counting was taught not with chalk but with beans, stones, or eggs in the basket. Mothers showed their children how to measure grain by handfuls, how to keep track of the hens and their eggs, how to reckon days by the phases of the moon or the bells of the church. Though most peasant mothers could not read or write themselves, they passed down a practical arithmetic and timekeeping that was essential for daily life. Songs and rhymes also served as tools for memory. A mother's lullaby might include counting verses or simple moral lessons hidden in the rhythm. Work songs, sung while spinning or kneading dough, imprinted tasks into children's minds. These chants carried not only melody but method, tying together labor, rhythm, and memory in a way that made learning natural. In teaching, mothers relied on patience and repetition. A child who spilled milk while learning to carry a pail would be scolded, yet the mother would guide them to try again. A daughter who tore a stitch while sewing was corrected, but encouraged to rethread the needle. These small lessons taught resilience. Mistakes were not the end, but steps towards skill. Beyond skills of survival, mothers also taught manners and behavior. They corrected how children greeted elders, reminded them to lower their voices in church, and showed them how to share food at the table. A child who grabbed too greedily might feel a mother's sharp glance, followed by a whispered reminder that generosity was both godly and necessary in a village where everyone depended on one another. Education from a peasant mother was not confined to the home. She often took her children with her to market days, where they learned the values of bargaining, trust, and community. A son might stand silently beside his mother as she exchanged eggs for cloth, listening to the rhythm of her words. A daughter might learn how to examine goods, how to recognize fair weight or poor quality. These were life lessons hidden in ordinary errands. Even storytelling became a form of education. Mothers recited folk tales, often with cautionary morals. Stories of children who wandered too far and met wolves, of those who disobeyed and suffered loss. Through these tales, children learned the dangers of straying from family and the rewards of obedience and diligence. The stories were both entertainment and instruction, filling children's minds with caution and courage in equal measure. So, while medieval peasant children rarely saw a parchment page, their mothers ensured they received an education as deep as the furrows in the fields. Through play, practice, correction, and story, mothers shaped their children into adults capable of surviving the harsh realities of their world. Every lesson carried a mother's care, even when hidden beneath sternness or toil. In this way, the peasant mother treated her children not only with love and discipline but with guidance that turned play into preparation and chores into learning. Her classroom may have been small, but its lessons endured a lifetime. Now, let us sink deeper into the shadows of medieval life, into the moments when joy and play gave way to worry. Those times when children grew ill, when hunger pressed close, or when plague swept through villages like a dark wind. In these moments, the way mothers treated their children revealed both their strength and their helplessness. Illness was a constant presence in peasant life. Colds, fevers, infected cuts, or coughs could turn dangerous quickly in a world with little access to doctors. Most peasants could not afford a physician. Instead, mothers became the healers of the household. Their knowledge was drawn from tradition, from older women, from herbs gathered in hedgerows, and from prayers whispered at night. A child feverish in bed might feel the touch of their mother's rough but careful hands, laying a damp cloth across the brow. She might brew a tea of chamomile, mint, or elderflower, coaxing her little one to sip from a wooden cup. For coughs, honey and herbs were mixed. For wounds, she boiled water, cleaned the cut, and bound it in linen strips torn from an old garment. In these small acts, a mother poured love into healing, even when cures were uncertain. But there were illnesses beyond her reach. Dysentery, measles, or the dreaded plague could sweep through a household with terrifying speed. When such sickness came, mothers treated their children with a fierce blend of devotion and desperation. They prayed to saints, lit candles in the parish church, or tied charms around their children's necks, begging for divine protection. Some mothers carried their children to holy wells or shrines, believing that sacred water or relics might bring relief. Others simply held their little ones through the long nights, whispering songs to comfort them even as fear gnawed at their own hearts. Hunger was another trial that tested a mother's treatment of her children. In times of bad harvest, when grain ran short and bread was thin, mothers often gave up portions of their own food to ensure their children had enough to survive. A mother might eat only scraps while saving the softer bread crusts or the richer portion of pottage for her little ones. The care was silent but profound. Hunger was endured more easily by an adult than by a child, and mothers bore that sacrifice with quiet resolve. The growth of children, through infancy into adolescence, was also marked by a mother's careful treatment. Infants were swaddled tightly, both for warmth and for safety, often tied to a cradleboard or laid near the hearth. Mothers rocked them with their feet while their hands spun wool or stirred the pot. When children began to walk, mothers guided their steps, sometimes tying them to a bench or keeping them within sight as chores continued. Care was constant, but it was also practical. Every action of love had to balance against the endless tasks of survival. As children grew older, mothers treated them with more expectation than indulgence. By the age of 7 or 8, a child was no longer seen as a baby but as a worker. The transition was marked not with celebration but with responsibility. A mother's tone grew firmer, her demands sharper. Yet, this sternness was itself an expression of care, for childhood could not linger in a world where survival required many hands. And then there were the times of plague. The Black Death of the 14th century, though beyond any mother's power to stop, reshaped family life in terrifying ways. Mothers who saw one child struck often feared for the others, knowing sickness might sweep through the entire home. Some carried their children far into the countryside, seeking escape. Others sealed doors, keeping their families close together in prayer. In these darkest hours, a mother's treatment of her children was marked by the deepest love, staying near, even when contagion threatened her own life. Many mothers, in fact, died beside their children, unwilling to abandon them even when survival meant leaving. So, the treatment of children by peasant mothers during sickness, hunger, and plague was both practical and sacrificial. They gave herbs, warmth, food, and prayers. They scolded when needed but wept when helpless. In every trial, their love was both fierce and quiet, woven into every choice they made. Their hands, cracked and tired, carried not just labor but the fragile thread of their children's survival. Now, let us draw close once more to the dim firelight, where shadows play across the low beams of a thatched cottage. Here, beyond food, chores, and survival, lies another layer of how mothers treated their children, the quiet realm of emotion and affection. Though life for peasants was hard, and tenderness often had to yield to necessity, affection was still present, sometimes hidden, sometimes fleeting, yet deeply felt. In a world where every day demanded toil, mothers rarely had time for the constant caresses and spoken reassurances that modern hearts might expect. Love was not expressed in words of praise or long embraces, but in small gestures woven into daily life. A piece of bread saved for a child, a woolen cloak mended late at night, a whispered song at the end of a weary day. These were the tokens of affection, subtle but powerful. Comfort came in moments when a child's tears broke through the rhythm of chores. A little one frightened by thunder might be gathered into a mother's lap, her calloused hand stroking their hair while her voice murmured a prayer. A boy who scraped his knee while tending animals might find his mother's rough fingers gently washing the wound. Her stern face softened for just a heartbeat. Mothers could not indulge sorrow for long, but in those short moments, their treatment was full of wordless reassurance. Affection was also shown in song. Mothers sang to lull their babies, sang while spinning, sang to drown out the weariness of endless tasks. These songs often carried verses about saints, moral lessons, or village life, but to the child listening, the rhythm of their mother's voice was a comfort stronger than words. Even as discipline was strict, a child knew through these songs that they were cherished. Mothers taught resilience by sharing their own endurance. When work was hard, when winter nights were cold, when hunger gnawed, they rarely gave way to despair in front of their children. Instead, they taught by example, lifting, stirring, carrying, and pressing forward. Their treatment of children was not only to shield them, but also to prepare them. They raised them to be strong enough to face the same hardships. A child comforted after a fall might soon be told to stand up and try again. This was not unkindness, but training for survival. Still, laughter was not absent. In the quiet evenings, when chores were done and the cottage was still, mothers sometimes told stories that made children smile. Folk tales, humorous village anecdotes, or even playful scolding, these lightened hearts. A child might remember their mother's tired face brightening with amusement, the rare sparkle in her eyes. These memories became treasures, carried into adulthood as reminders that even in poverty, there was warmth. Mothers also treated their children's fears with both severity and comfort. If a child feared the dark, she might scold them for weakness, yet still hang a sprig of protective herbs near their bed. If a child worried about spirits or witches, she might tell them to pray bravely, then quietly whisper her own prayers as she tucked them under a blanket. Love and fear were balanced with practicality, ensuring children felt both strengthened and guarded. Resilience was shaped not only through discipline but through affection that did not spoil. A child who survived to adulthood often remembered their mother's love as silent, steady, and enduring. She might not have said, "I love you" in the way we know today, but her treatment showed it. In bread divided fairly, in wounds carefully bound, in the warmth of her body pressed close on cold nights when families huddled together against winter's chill. In this way, peasant mothers gave their children an emotional foundation as strong as any stone church wall. They did not coddle, for the world outside was too harsh for softness alone. But they did comfort, they did guide, and they did love in ways that children understood with their hearts, even if words were seldom spoken. So, in the quiet rhythm of peasant life, affection was not absent. It was simply woven into the fabric of necessity, hidden in deeds, gestures, and songs. And in the memories of those children grown, it was remembered as a steady light in an otherwise demanding world. As the story of daily life in medieval peasant households moves toward its closing reflections, we find the role of mothers as not only nurturers, but also as the very anchors of family resilience. In the later medieval centuries, the rhythms of peasant life began to change ever so slightly. Small improvements in agricultural practices, such as the adoption of the heavy plow or the three-field system, created modest increases in productivity. And while these gains often went to the lords and landholders, some fragments of benefit trickled into the lives of ordinary peasants. For the children of these households, it sometimes meant a steadier diet, slightly more secure survival, and with it, new responsibilities at younger ages. Mothers remained the guiding hands who taught children how to adapt to these small changes. A peasant mother would explain, with patience honed by her own years of experience, why a field must be left fallow one year, or why certain grains had to be sown in rotation. Though children were rarely given formal education in crop management, they absorbed these rhythms simply by accompanying their mothers into the fields, or onto the edge of the village commons. A daughter might sit beside her mother, watching as she sorted seeds, her small hands imitating the careful motions, while the mother explained in quiet, almost lullaby-like tones, the difference between barley meant for bread and oats meant for the animals. In this way, maternal teaching was oral, practical, and constant. It was not the structured classroom that wealthier children might know, but a flowing transfer of knowledge, folded into the daily sounds of wooden buckets, lowing cattle, and the crackle of hearth fires. Seasonal rhythms and childhood. The peasant mother's treatment of her children was shaped by the seasons, as much as by affection or necessity. In springtime, she might wake her children before dawn, gently but firmly, to help scatter seed. In summer, her tone might be more urgent, urging them to keep pace with the harvesting, while reminding them to protect themselves from the sun with simple cloth coverings. Autumn was a time for careful gathering, and here mothers were vigilant, scolding children who dawdled or spilled precious grain. In winter the mood softened, work slowed, and mothers would gather their children by the fire, telling them stories drawn from folk tradition, tales of saints, of wandering spirits, or of cautionary figures meant to instill both wonder and discipline. To the modern ear, such stories may sound like mere superstition, but for the medieval child, these tales were both entertainment and instruction. A mother's story about a greedy spirit who stole bread was a way to teach children about the importance of sharing food. A bedtime tale about a careless boy who lost his way in the forest carried lessons in attentiveness and obedience, affection and firmness. It would be a mistake to think of medieval peasant mothers as purely harsh taskmasters. Surviving sources, though sparse, do suggest affection expressed through small gestures. A mother might tuck a woolen blanket around a child on a bitter night, hum a simple lullaby, or press a kiss to a fevered forehead. These quiet moments mattered, though they were rarely recorded by chroniclers, who paid more attention to the affairs of kings than to the tenderness of mothers. Yet archaeological finds, such as small carved toys or child-sized shoes carefully mended, give us glimpses of maternal love woven into daily objects. Still, discipline was unavoidable. Peasant mothers corrected their children with stern words, and sometimes with physical chastisement, as was the norm of the age. To us, the image may feel harsh, but within the medieval worldview, such measures were considered necessary for survival. A careless child could easily ruin a day's food by dropping it into the mud, or risk injury by playing too close to livestock. Correction was protection, and mothers bore the heavy responsibility of delivering it. The shared burden of care. By the late Middle Ages, mothers were not alone in raising children. Older siblings, especially daughters, were drawn into the circle of care. A 10-year-old girl might be tasked with tending her younger brothers and sisters while her mother worked in the fields. This system of shared responsibility created a hierarchy within the peasant household. The mother remained the central figure of authority, but older children often imitated her, scolding or guiding the younger ones with the same phrases and gestures they had absorbed. Despite this hierarchy, warmth existed. Mothers encouraged play where possible, often weaving it into work. A child might be asked to sing a counting song while gathering herbs, turning dull repetition into a game. A mother might smile at the sight of children making mud dolls or imitating adults with pretend wooden tools. Such moments of laughter softened the strictness of peasant life, offering memories that, though seldom recorded, must have been deeply cherished. Faith and the mother's role. Religion continued to shape how mothers treated their children. The parish priest might preach about obedience, humility, and the duties of parents, and mothers internalized these teachings. A sick child might be taken not only to a local healer but also to the church for blessings. Mothers taught children prayers as soon as they could speak, urging them to cross themselves before eating, to respect Sundays, and to fear sin. In this, mothers were both spiritual and practical guardians, blending the needs of the body with the needs of the soul. The intertwining of maternal love, practical necessity, seasonal rhythm, and religious guidance created a tapestry of childhood in medieval peasant households that was at once demanding and nurturing. Children were not indulged in the modern sense, but they were rarely neglected. Within the tight circle of the hearth, under the constant supervision of their mothers, they were shaped into the next generation of peasants, strong, adaptable, and deeply rooted in the rhythms of the land. And so, as the 14th and 15th centuries unfolded, the essential character of the peasant mother's role remained. She was a teacher, a disciplinarian, a provider, a nurse, and a storyteller. Through her hands, the fragile line of survival was carried forward. As our long walk through the lives of medieval peasant mothers comes to an end, let us pause for a moment, and allow the images to settle gently in the mind. You have seen, through quiet description and careful detail, how mothers in England, centuries ago, guided their children through the fragile balance of survival. Their days were heavy with labor, yet woven with affection. They cradled infants against rough wool gowns, lulled them with soft humming under low thatched ceilings, and scolded them sharply when danger loomed too close. They taught their daughters to spin and their sons to herd, their voices steady and patient, carried on the smoke of peat fires and the sound of wooden spoons stirring porridge in earthen pots. Mothers were the first teachers, the protectors, the healers at a bedside where herbs were laid out with trembling care. They were storytellers, passing down myths of saints and spirits by the flicker of tallow candles. They were disciplinarians, ensuring their children learned not only to obey, but to endure. In their hands, the fragile thread of family survival was spun again and again, binding each new generation to the soil, the seasons, and the sacred rituals of the village. Though the centuries have shifted, and the tools and comforts of our modern world are far removed from the harsh fields of medieval England, the echoes remain. A mother bending to soothe a crying child, a whispered lullaby to still a restless night, a firm word meant not from cruelty, but from care. These images remain timeless. And now, as we bring this long reflection to its close, let your mind rest. Imagine the crackle of a small fire in a dark cottage, the scent of wood smoke and bread, the distant sound of a child's laughter, fading as the day settles into night. See, in the dim glow, a mother drawing her children close, wrapping them in warmth and in the lessons of her time. Take a deep breath now. Breathe in slowly. Hold it, and let it out gently. Feel the calmness of centuries past, washing softly over you. Close your eyes if you wish. Imagine the rhythm of a simpler age, the clatter of wooden wheels, the sweep of a mother's hands over coarse cloth, the murmur of prayers whispered at dawn. And as your breathing slows, remember, the story of those long-ago mothers is not merely history. It is a reminder of care, of endurance, and of the quiet power of love in the hardest of times. So rest your mind now. Let the echoes of their world fade like the last glow of a hearth. And in the silence that follows, feel the peace of time itself, holding you gently, as a mother once held her child.